Yes, you're probably wondering, what, Joe? Another typewriter? And my answer is yes, of course, another typewriter. Well, yes, do I need another typewriter? Well, of course not. Nobody needs another typewriter. Well, maybe I do. Maybe I do need another typewriter. Isn't she a lovely thing? Actually, he. I guess my wife says it's a he. Well, it's a 1957 Olympia SM3 in kind of this lovely kind of olive green color. And a week ago today, last Sunday, when I was conducting the kickoff meeting of the Albuquerque Typewriter Society, my wife and oldest grandson were out doing antique and thrift store shopping. Ostensibly, the young man is interested in getting some fancy threads and suits and whatever, so they were out shopping for that, and they wandered into one of my favorite places for thrifting. And they spotted this Olympia typewriter, and my wife thought that I should take a look at it. It was in its case, of course, and so she hid the typewriter underneath a piece of furniture in the store so that nobody else would find it and it would be available for me to look at. And so, sure enough, they were closed on Monday, so that Tuesday, which was kind of documented in the last video. This is not a vlog. Tuesday I went over and sure enough there it was, and picked it up for a pretty decent price, under $60, which in this part of the world for a commercial store, a business, that's not a bad price, especially for a typewriter in the shape it was in. There's evidence that this machine has never been serviced. And I say that because the rear panel below the rear tab slugs, the whole back panel, is secured by 4 screws, and the screws are painted the same olive green as the rest of the machine. And it looks like the screws had never been loosened, because when I went to loosen them, it cracks the paint around the base of the screw. So it looks like the machine had never been opened, and it was evidence of that is all the deposit of decades of eraser crumbs all inside the machine. There was also a sizable deposit of a white chalky film, which I think is from the person using a humidifier, which is probably means it was used around this part of the country in the Southwest, because humidifiers are commonly used, especially in the wintertime when it's so dry here. When it's not actually snowing, it's really dry air. So I'm thinking it was a locally used typewriter. Probably a lady had it and she used it for decades, and it was never serviced, I don't think, because there's no sticker, dealer sticker or shop sticker on the machine at all. It was pretty gummed up though, and the escapement had a lot of problems with it. It was only half spacing for quite a bit of time there last week when I was working on it. It took me a long time using different chemicals like isopropyl alcohol and naphtha and automotive PB blaster degreaser, and a little bit of a silicone spray lube and some gun oil and things like that. But I used a lot of PB blaster, especially around the escapement, to get it working, and it looks like it's all working nice now. But because of the PB blaster, the degreaser, it's pretty stinky, and it had been sitting out in my garage this latter half of last week. And it's only about 48 degrees Fahrenheit in the garage, so it's not really warm enough for that automotive degreaser to evaporate, to outgas. So I have it out here in the front courtyard, and this courtyard, of course, it's the walls of the house are on one side, and then the walls of the courtyard are on the other 2 sides. And it's really balmy. If it's not actually windy, it's a really balmy, convenient environment out here in the wintertime in the sun. It gets kind of too hot out here in the summertime, of course, in the daytime, but in the wintertime it's really nice. And I thought it would be a perfect place to let the typewriter get some sun and to let some of that PB blaster outgas. And so here it is, sitting out here. Hopefully it'll be a lot less stinky. But the machine types beautifully, and it has a great touch to it. My wife is kind of enjoying typing on it, and I wouldn't classify her as a real typewriter aficionado, not yet. But she's the one that kind of enabled me to have this typewriter to begin with, which I think is significant. And she just named him Ollie. So we have a name now, and I think anytime you name an inanimate object, you've immediately derived some kind of emotional connection with it. So there is that. You know, I was thinking about when we acquired this typewriter last week. I don't necessarily go to every thrift and antique store in town all the time. In other words, there might be some typewriters that I do miss if in terms of finding them out in the wild. But I would say that I'm pretty good about looking for typewriters, and it's been a big dry spell, I would say, finding typewriters of real quality and worth buying. There's a lot of junky typewriters I've seen in the last few months, and that I have purposefully avoided picking up because I just know what it would take to repair them would be too much in terms of finding parts availability or whatever. So, you know, I am a little bit, I would say, a little bit selective now when I'm looking at typewriters out in the public, and it leads me to this train of thought about is the typewriter revival, is it continuing? Is it ongoing? Is it going to, are the supply of good typewriters going to dry up? And I know I've talked to people before about this, and they say, you know, Joe, there were millions of typewriters made back in the day, so there's got to be millions of them out there still for us to collect. And I would say, well, yeah, it's true there were a lot of typewriters made back in the day, but I'm not so sure if there's that many left. I don't think there's millions left. Maybe there are. I've conducted a number of public typewriter events in the last couple of years, and one of the things that strikes me now when I think back upon it is there are very few typewriters that I've seen, manual typewriters, that are absolutely perfectly without some kind of minor flaw. I think about this when you look at newcomers to typewriters and they expect a typewriter to behave like any other kind of commercially manufactured consumer good. And yet that's not really the relationship we need to have with manual typewriters if we are to live with them in peace in their extended lifetime, because they are used appliances that don't have replacement parts available for the most part. And it's more like owning an old automobile. An antique automobile you're constantly having to tinker with. There's always something, a little niggling, nagging, a little problem. And in order for people to live with typewriters as a useful tool, a useful creative tool, you have to be able to deal with those problems. You have to be able to live with them. There's a certain threshold below which a person can probably live with a nagging problem and just work around it. On the other hand, there are certain bigger problems above which you do have to get them fixed, and it becomes a real hindrance to using them. So it's an interesting relationship that we have, because we have become a definite consumer society, a consumer culture. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the planned obsolescence of our modern technology. But these older machines were, for the most part, designed for an era where there was no, very much less planned obsolescence. They fail gracefully, is a way to put it. It's not like they completely break and you have to throw them away, but they do start to develop mechanical little issues that sometimes can be very troublesome. And if you are an amateur typewriter tinkerer like I am, you'll soon be aware, if you aren't already, you'll soon be aware of the difficulties at times in trying to iron out the last few remaining bugs in that otherwise wonderful typewriter that you expect to work perfectly. And it took me a long time to learn this, because back when in my formative typewriter years, back in I'd say the 1980s, I was more interested in electronic typewriters because the only thing that really mattered to me was the quality of imprint, the consistency and evenness of the imprint. Whereas now I'm much more accepting of the imperfections that a manual typewriter renders on paper. And I look upon that as sort of more of an organic kind of a thing now. I'm much more accepting of it. And even typographical errors are less troublesome to me, I think. But it's an interesting thought, and I could see why a lot of typewriter poets enjoy using typewriters as much as they do, because that imperfect organic nature of the impression on paper kind of lends an effect that enhances the creative aspect of a poem, I think. And so there's a process in learning to live and use manual typewriters. They're less than perfect. And so it's for this reason that I do wonder how much of an impact upon society manual typewriters will ever make in the future, if most people's expectations of a consumer good is that it better work perfectly or else. Well, let's take a look at this Olympia SM3, shall we? Well, let's start with the keyboard. So on the upper left, this button here, this lever, unlocks the carriage for transport. So if you pull it up like that, it's locked, and if you push it down, it is unlocked. Right below it is the margin release key, and then you have your shift and shift lock. And your two shift buttons are independent of each other. So if you notice, when I push this one down, this one here doesn't move. So they're both independent of each other. The keyboard has no number 1. You have to use a lowercase l, but it does have a plus and an equals up here. And on the right side, you have an exclamation mark and a 3/4. So it's that kind of hybrid keyboard. It does have the 1/4, 1/2, and the cent and at symbol, as is consistent with the American keyboards of this era. And there's a tab key, and this has tab slugs in the back of the carriage. Look at the left side of the carriage. Well, you have your left carriage knob, and of course it clicks like that. And you have your carriage return line advanced lever right here. And then right inboard of the left carriage knob is your line selector, and it goes between 1, 1.5, and 2 lines. And so that amounts to 1 click is a half a line. And then this lever right here will temporarily disengage the ratcheting for the line spacing, but if you flip it back, you'll restore the original line spacing. So that's the temporary line spacing disconnect right there. And then right up here you can see the left-hand finger for the paper bail that lifts up like that. Okay, this is the rear of the machine, and the most prominent thing you can see on the rear of the machine are these adjustable tab stops. And these basically, you push them in and then you can slide them left or right. And the cool thing is there is a scale, a paper scale, on the back here that corresponds to the other 2 scales on the machine, the one behind the platen and the one on the paper bail itself. Then the other control back here is the deployment button for the paper support right there. And earlier I had mentioned the screws on this to remove this back panel. These 4 little green painted screws were the ones that I noticed had never been removed from the machine, so it gives me good evidence that this machine had never been serviced. Okay, on the right side of the carriage you have your right platen knob, and this platen knob has a center button that if you push it, it disengages the clutch inside the platen roller, and it allows you to permanently shift the position of the paper vertically in the platen. So this is the permanent change of the vertical spacing. You have the pressure release lever that releases the pressure rollers underneath the platen, and it also lifts up the paper bail like that. And then there is the carriage release lever or button right here. This machine only has 1 carriage release button on the right side of the carriage, like a lot of portables do. And you might be able to see here the card guides. This one here is a little loose, but anyway, you can see on the paper bail the rubber rollers, and they're actually in pretty good condition on this machine, as is the platen. It's a little hard, but not too bad. And then, of course, this has this spring-loaded little plate up here. So on the top of the machine, you're going to see the margin adjustments, and these are the you pinch and slide them like that. Just pinch them together and slide them either way. There is a scale behind the margin settings to indicate the margin, and there's also a scale on the paper bale, and there's also the center point marked in a red triangle, the center of the paper, if you've aligned the paper guide up to the 0 position, that is. And you'll notice on the paper bale that it actually has 2 fingers, one on each side, which is a nice feature to have. A lot of these portables only have a finger on the right side for lifting it up. So with the ribbon cover lifted up, I'll point out to you that there are 2 little springs, one here and one here, and these are designed to secure the little latch levers on the lid, and this one on the right works fine, but the one on the left, the little bend in the little formation here is broken off at some time in the past, so only the right side of the ribbon cover is secured, but that's not a big deal. It doesn't really hinder the operation of it any. So on the right side over here you have the tension adjustment, the touch adjustment, and it goes from minimal touch at the back all the way to maximum touch on the front, and it actually does make quite a bit of difference. The way this thing is designed is it works pretty ingeniously because it has a plate underneath that's pushing up against the bottom of the type bar linkages, and it is affecting a definite spring tension difference when you pull it up like that. And so the ribbon spools are here, and this is the classic Olympia system using the little auto-reversing guides, and has the little spring-loaded arms that keeps the ribbon pack tight within each spool, and of course the ribbon vibrator. And down on the keyboard here is the color selector here. The top position is black, and the middle is stencil, and the bottom is red. So one thing I noticed about this machine that I really like is if you're using relatively thin paper, that if you feed it in like this and spin the platen knob, it generally will feed directly underneath the 2 rollers of the paper bale without you needing to lift the paper bale first. So it's kind of a quick loading thing. It's just easy to change paper. One little step less that you have to do, and I really like the precision of that. And back to the backwards typing. Let's do backwards typing, shall we? Let's see. A, B, Q, W-E-R-T-Y, space, shift, T-Y-P-E, space, shift, W-R-I-T-E-R. Albuquerque typewriter. It has a nice imprint, actually. Nice alignment on the text. It's very even. Well, this is a pretty neat typewriter, I gotta say. There's a lot of subjective things about it that I really like. On paper, if you just compare features, for instance, with other well-named medium-sized portable typewriters, you might think, well, that kind of compares with Remingtons and Smith Coronas and maybe Hermes, but there's a certain touch and feel to this machine that, man, it is really special. I've owned 2 of the newer modeled SMs of the Olympias, and I gotta say, if you compare just individual samples, of course, I've only had one 1960s SM9 and one 1970s to compare it with, but there's a certain tightness in the linkages here with this late 50s SM3 that just wasn't present in those later models. The later models, there was kind of like a certain play in the key. There was a certain touch right as you begin to touch the key top with your finger that would happen before any of the linkages started to be activated, whereas this one is really tight. You barely touch that key and that type bar begins to move up. And so, yeah, it has a tightness to it, a firmness to it that I really like, a solidity. I really love the styling of this machine, just this kind of flat, elegant look with slightly rounded edges. The textured paint on this is not as textured as, let's say, the Smith Coronas from the 50s. It's more like a Remington kind of texture, and I really like it. I really, of course, love this color, this muted kind of olive green color. The chrome trim, of course, around the sides of the typewriter, really beautiful, just an elegant machine. And I find what's interesting about it is the touch selector here. underneath the ribbon cover here on the right side. It really does affect a change. And I was reading on, oddly enough, on I have a copy of the user's guide or user's manual for my Remington Quietwriter, and just last night I was reading through it, and I found this to be true on this machine as well as the Remington Quietwriter, which is, according to the guide, if you set your touch control all the way to the lightest setting, it might feel lighter than the heaviest setting, but the heavier settings will give you less chance of the type bars interfering with each other if you are a very rapid typer. So I noticed keeping this in about the middle position of the tension of the touch really does help. You can still get a light touch, but it's really snappy, and so I like it for that reason. So if you're a newcomer to typewriters and you're wondering why did the touch selector have such a heavy setting, people back then in the days must have had really strong hands, and it's probably true. We are probably a little bit weaker in our hands these days. Nevertheless, this heavier touch side of the adjustment, it really is for speeding up the action of the type bars so that if you're a really staccato, snappy typer, there'll be less chance that they interfere each other, especially type bars that are close together on the segment there. This is a carriage shift machine, and as such, it is, of course, going to be a heavier feel to it than if you had a segment shift machine. However, some of my ultra portable typewriters out there that have carriage shift actually tend to rotate the carriage more like that rather than actually lift them. And you'll find more commonly these medium-sized portables, they actually lift the carriage. So you are, in fact, lifting a little bit more weight. But I find it's not really that bad. I think they did a pretty good job of optimizing the weight of it and the linkages and all that. So I don't see too much bad with this machine at all. You might argue it's a carriage shift, so maybe that's not as nice as the later models that were segment shift, and you might say, well, it doesn't have a key set tabulator, it has the preset slugs. This one has 6 slugs back here. But yeah, as far as tabs, that doesn't bother me. These are easy to change, and I've never needed more than 6 tab positions in practical terms. So anyways, I don't see the tabs as a limitation. Maybe the carriage shift might be, but you know what? This machine types and feels so good. I can't really say much bad about it at all. And I really love the typeface. It has a really elegant typeface. It's actually an 11 character per inch typeface. So right in between Pica and Elite, which is a nice size. Yeah, this is Ollie, the new collection member in the family of typewriters here at the Van Cleve household. And yes, my wife was instrumental in acquiring Ollie, and I think that's important. Ollie's probably going to be a long-term family member, and Ollie cleaned up quite well. And I might add, by the way, that since I had Ollie outside most of the day today, that actually it's mostly outgassed. It's been in the house here for a couple hours now. Well, yeah, probably 3 or 4 hours, and not much of an odor anymore is coming out. So keeping it out in that bright winter sun and fresh air seemed to have done a lot to get rid of the last remnants of the PB Blaster degreaser. So, well, this is Joe Van Cleve with a few rambling thoughts about typewriter collecting, this beautiful little machine. If you guys find a machine like this out in the wild in a thrift store, antique store, being sold by someone locally, man, you should get it, because in my experience, as I indicated earlier, it's harder and harder to come by really good quality machines these days, especially ones being sold for a decent price. And so this is one of these keepers, one of these rare gems that looks like it was cared for lovingly and pristine condition, not a nick, scratch, or anything on it. So I'm really excited about it. Well, you guys stay creative and have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye.